We have an unusually large crowd with us this evening, so it'll take us a few moments to admit you all from the waiting room. I'll ask you to just be patient for a minute or two while we bring you all in to this evening's event on White Rage. It's a pleasure to have you all this evening. We're excited about the event and about the conversation that's going to follow. All right, we have several more people coming in here, so I'll ask you to just bear with me. For those who are just arriving, my name is Sean Latham. I'm the director of the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities, the host for this evening's event, and it's a pleasure to welcome you. So I'll ask you to bear with us for just one more minute while we continue to admit people into the meeting. As you come in, you'll see that we're muting your microphones to minimize the background noise, but we will encourage you to be participating through the chat feature throughout this evening's event. As I said, it's a pleasure to have you all here. And it's a very great pleasure to welcome you, even though we can't be in person. This virtual event is bringing together, I can see people from all over the country, as well as all over the Oklahoma for this consideration of Right Rage, conducted, of course, in sponsorship and partnership with the Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission. And this event was designed as a way of helping us think through Tulsa's own violent and complicated racial history, and framing it and rethinking about it in the larger context of American history and an American future as well. All right, I think we have a good enough crowd here. We're going to go ahead and get started. We'll have several more people continuing to filter in. It's a pleasure to welcome you. I'll just say once again that my name is Sean Latham. I'm the Pauline McFarland Walter Professor of English here at the University of Tulsa and the director of the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities, which is one of the hosts for this evening's event. Before we get going, I want to say just a few words about the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities and our activities. Basically, here on campus and in the city of Tulsa, we have two missions, the first of which is to act as a think tank. And to do that, we bring together experts from our faculty, from the student body, and from the larger Tulsa community in order to work each year on a problem or a set of ideas that we can think can only be fully addressed using the distinctive tool of the arts and humanities. And in addition to that, we then host between 30 and 35 public programs every year that seek to bring that work that we're doing on campus and in our research seminars out into the larger community and to engage in ways that we think are productive as a way of addressing significant problems, challenges, and questions in our communities and in our polity. Throughout the 2020-2021 academic year, we've been working on the conjoined themes of rage and courage, two concepts that we think speak very powerfully to this moment, and I hope you've joined us for some of the events we've already conducted this year, and I hope you'll join us for some of our upcoming events as well. And I'll say just a few words about what we have coming up next at the center. So we're taking next week off, but on the 18th of February at 7 p.m., we'll be welcoming Dr. Elizabeth Utka, Professor of English at the University of Richmond, who will be giving a talk called Zombies, Seances, and the Unrestful Dead. She'll be talking essentially about the long history of art after pandemics, and especially pandemics in the 20th century, and how artists and filmmakers and musicians and novelists have responded to the kind of historical and cultural trauma that we ourselves are experiencing right now. In a couple of weeks, we'll also have, at the very end of this month, we'll have an event that focuses on art and activism at the southern border as we welcome Mauricio Cordero from MIT. He's the editor of this collection called Border X, which is a comic novel rendition or I should say a graphic novel rendition of narratives from people who have been detained at the southern border. He's been working in close partnership with human rights organizations that are working at the southern border and on the crisis there now. We have additional events coming up as well, including events focused on climate change. We have a paired event with this one called Black Rage that will take place later in the spring semester, and much, much more. You can learn more about all of our events by visiting the Humanities Center website at humanities.utulsa.edu. There you can find additional reading lists and blogs, as well as an opportunity to subscribe to our newsletter and get information about all of our events. So as I said, as you came in tonight, your microphones will be muted throughout the course of this event, but we strongly encourage you to participate in the chat. One of the great advantages of the Zoom medium in particular is that you will have an opportunity not to hold your questions to the end, but ask them as they occur to you, make comments as they occur to you. Tonight's program is designed to be conversational and interactive, so we'll urge you to join us in the chat from early on. And in fact, I'd like to urge you right now, as we do at all of our OCH events, to take a moment and introduce yourself in the chat. Just tell us who you are, where you're from, and what's drawn you to this event. It will give us a sense to create community and create some kind of human connection. One of the great challenges of running a humanities center right now, as you can imagine, is trying to figure out how to do it without any humans actually in our immediate presence. And we find this chat feature is one way to do that. So I'll urge you right now to please just take a moment and introduce yourselves in the chat. We also have several copies of the book that we're featuring tonight, White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide by Dr. Carol Anderson. If you live here in Tulsa, copies of this book are still available for free at Fulton Street Books. All you need to do is drop by the bookstore in North Tulsa and you'll be able to pick up a copy. If you live outside of the Tulsa region, we'll be giving away copies of this book to those who ask questions in the chat. Just the people who ask the first questions this evening will get copies of the book mailed to them and we'll contact you after the event. So we urge you to take advantage of that. I can see you're beginning to already introduce yourselves in the chat, and I'm grateful for that. It's a pleasure to welcome you all here. I should also, before we turn to tonight's event, note that we've already decided on our theme for next year at the Humanities Center as well. So throughout the 2021 and 2022 academic year, we'll be shifting our focus to the theme of renewal and recovery, a topic we think we'll be able to use to think not only through our present moment, but to explore how other cultures and communities have responded to the shocks of pogroms, disease, revolution, insurrection, and disaster that we ourselves are facing. We imagine exploring topics ranging from Greenwood's recovery after the 1921 race massacre to the aftermath of political upheaval and the ongoing challenge of meeting climate change, and calls for both student and faculty fellows as well as fellows from the larger Tulsa community will go out next month. It's now my pleasure to welcome tonight's speakers, who will be joining us to talk about a topic that is far more urgent now than when we first conceived this program over a year ago. We gather tonight, as it were, caught between two extraordinary events. On the one hand, the rolling series of Black Lives Matter protests that grew out of police violence in Ferguson to focus now our national attention on questions of racism, policing, and the carceral state. And on the other, the stunning invasion by a crowd of largely white insurrectionists who attacked the seat of our democratic government while decrying fraud in overwhelmingly Black voting districts. For some, the Black Lives Matter movement is a new civil rights movement for the 21st century, while for others, it marks merely the latest expression of a fight for civil rights that began the moment Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation and has continued through the subsequent 150 years of both vital victories and devastating reversals. This evening's program is sponsored in part by the Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission, and indeed it's a grant from them that allowed us to purchase the copies of White Rage and distribute them throughout the Tulsa community. And as we approach the 100th anniversary of that white terrorist attack that burned one of the country's most prosperous Black communities to the ground, it's essential to remember that American history is filled with mirror images of events like the BLM protests and the January 6th insurrection. We see them written, of course, on the very geography of Tulsa itself. Our event tonight is built around a community discussion of Professor Carol Anderson's powerful account of Black civil rights in the United States, White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide. Its core thesis is both simple and sobering. Since the Civil War, nearly every advance in Black civil rights, she argued, has been met with resistance and retrenchment designed to cement white supremacy. Some of these reactions are readily visible in segregated schools and lynchings, while others are more subtle and insidious, ranging from drug enforcement policies to the manipulation of homeowner covenants and zoning laws. We're here tonight to think about this history and to reflect on how it can help us both understand and effectively respond to the entrenched structures of American racism, every bit as evident now as they were in Tulsa 100 years ago. As I said at the outset, copies of Professor Anderson's book have been made freely available through the Tulsa Race Massacre Commission and through Fulton Street Books here in Tulsa, and we're grateful to their help and for their help and support. We do still have a few copies remaining, as I said, when we get to the Q&A session this evening, or really throughout the event, anytime anybody that asks a question, we'll send you a copy of this book if you haven't been able to pick one up already. Now, we're fortunate tonight because we're joined by two experts in the history of civil rights who will first offer us some reflections of their own and then lead us through a discussion of Professor Anderson's provocative thesis. Robert Jackson is the James G. Watson Professor of English at the University of Tulsa and is currently one of the research fellows in the Rage Seminar at the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities. He has doctoral degrees in both history and English and publishes widely on race and civil rights at the intersection of film, literature, and activism. His most recent book, Fade In Crossroads, A History of Southern Cinema, considers the varied relations between Black and white Southerners and the motion picture medium from the silent era to the mid-20th century. And he is currently at work on a new book about James Baldwin and Robert Kennedy. Julian Hayter is Associate Professor of Leadership Studies at the University of Richmond, where he teaches courses on justice and civil society. He is the author of The Dream is Lost, Voting Rights and the Politics of Race in Richmond, Virginia. And in both his scholarship and teaching, urges us to look closely at local histories and practices and the way that they fit into a larger mosaic of national patterns. I'm certain, in fact, that he would have a great deal to teach us about how to think about Tulsa on the occasion of the Race Massacre centenary. I hope you'll now join me in welcoming our guests for this discussion, one that will be as challenging as it is necessary. As I said throughout the evening, I would urge you immediately when a comment or question comes to mind, please just put it in the chat. We have some students here who are helping us moderate that chat, and we'll call those questions to attention. But we urge you to make use of this medium as best you can and to keep engaged with the talk and conversation as it unfolds. We'll begin with a brief conversation between our two guests this evening, and then it will become a much more free-flowing Q&A as the evening goes on. So please, I'll pause now, and even though they won't be able to hear you, I'll ask you to please join me in welcoming Dr. Jackson and Dr. Hayter for this evening's event. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bob, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. This is it's an exciting event. I'm glad everybody's here, and I want to just say a couple of words before we start. In thanks to Sean and Tara for organizing, and for the Humanities Center and the Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission for their support. As Dr. Latham mentioned, I have been participating in a seminar with the Humanities Center this year, and the scholars in that group who have been doing that work with me, we've really made some great headway, and I want to thank them for helping me think through a lot of these difficult topics as well. And finally, I want to thank my friend Julian Hayter, who is a prominent historian of civil rights and a leading figure in public history today, who has worked, I think in 2020, he's a celebrity now, about as hard as anybody in bringing these complex historical issues to broad public audiences. He's also a friend of mine from graduate school, so it's nice to have this opportunity to take up some conversations that we started many years ago in Virginia. We've talked a couple of times over the last few weeks about what we might say tonight, but kept coming back to the idea that the most interesting things that we're going to hear tonight are probably going to be coming from everyone else. So I'm really eager to keep my remarks short tonight and look forward to the conversation as it emerges afterwards. Yeah, so Carol Anderson is a very interesting scholar. Her early work as a historian actually had very little to do with the domestic issues in the United States. She was much more focused on the role of African Americans in contributing to American diplomacy and international relations, especially in the mid-20th century. So while she has long been interested in civil rights history, she has had a very different kind of outward looking perspective devoted to Black internationalism and globalism. And I think this comes out in White Rage in different parts because she's so focused on policy. She really has a great knowledge of legal history and political institutions. And as she writes at the beginning of White Rage, she came to this topic much later in her career, really only in the last 20 or so years, after a number of events of police violence, drew her attention more squarely to contemporary domestic concerns. And after she published White Rage in 2016, she followed with a short book called One Person, No Vote: How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy. And that was published in 2018. You ought to take a look at this one as well. It reads like sort of like a sequel or maybe a companion piece to White Rage. And it tells the story of the crude but highly effective tools that were used in the early years of Jim Crow, poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and so on, all the way up to the more sophisticated and comparably influential voter suppression strategies that are in use in the 21st century. She makes it clear that voter suppression is perhaps the single most important site of contemporary struggle for civil rights. And that was published in 2018. So here we are in 2021, and a huge amount has happened in the last few months that makes me wonder what high school textbooks are going to be saying about this period of US history just a few years from now. I don't know how anybody's going to write the history of this period. But I think we'd all agree that voting has become a topic of greater public interest than at any time since at least the 2000 presidential election, and probably since a lot earlier than that. As of this week, however, Anderson's sense of the importance of the fight over voting rights is certainly prescient. There are 106 different bills in state legislatures around this country designed to make it more difficult for people to vote. That's a lot of action so soon after the 2020 election saw a record voter turnout in a number of key states. So politics has no expiration date. We know this. And even as we struggle to process the traumatic events of our very recent history, the future is being hammered out in legislative battles, in redistricting and gerrymandering, in census counts, and of course, in the struggles of ordinary people and voting rights groups to secure the right to vote for as many American citizens as possible. So I agree with Anderson in this respect, in thinking that voting is really a seminal issue for our time. And it makes me read White Rage a little bit differently in light of what's happened since that book was published, to go back and really keep all of the interest in voting at the forefront of what I'm getting out of that book. A few more little comments here before I turn it over to Julian and see what he has to say. I like what Anderson says at the beginning of the book. She says, White Rage is not about visible violence, but rather it works its way through the courts, the legislatures, and a range of government bureaucracies. It wreaks havoc subtly, almost imperceptibly, too imperceptibly, certainly for a nation consistently drawn to the spectacular, to what it can see. It's not the Klan. White Rage doesn't have to wear sheets, burn crosses, or take to the streets. Working the halls of power, it can achieve its ends far more effectively, far more destructively. The cause of White Rage, she argues, is simple. It is called Black advancement. And it's much the same way, White Rage is telling the story of American race relations since the Civil War. And it is really a history defined by the simple problem of what to do with nearly 4 million African Americans who became citizens. And the men, anyway, given the right to vote and run for public office. And so much of the history since then, according to Anderson's argument, is simply the story of white reaction against the prospect of Black freedom. And I think the simplest and the most comprehensive answer to the problem, to the question that she poses, is Jim Crow. And by that, I mean all of the structures of modern racial segregation: legal, economic, social, cultural, and so on. It took a few decades after the Civil War and emancipation to figure this out. And most historians place the consolidation of Jim Crow segregation around the 1890s. That's really the decade in which it was developed most fully into policy. But Jim Crow has been a devastatingly consistent and tenacious system for a long time. And I would even argue that it continued throughout the civil rights era of the 50s and 60s and into our time as well. Anderson is particularly interested in the lives of institutions. And it really is a book about policy as much as anything else. So Reconstruction and the chapter on Brown versus Board of Education, for example, are especially focused on politics and law. But even in some of these sections about, say, something like the Great Migration, right? It takes place largely in courtrooms, and there's a lot of interest in the legal and political structures that shape the lives of all of these people. So I want to just sort of throw out an opening question. What does it say about modern US history? And I'm talking about policy history here in much the way that Anderson is, that it can be packaged so fully under the umbrella or under this sort of category that she calls white rage. And with that, I want to hear what Julian has to say.
Hey, it's great to be here. It's good to be back with you, Bob. I have to say a lot of similar things. And, I'd like to, two thinkers I think really sum up Carol Anderson's book perfectly. One is Alexis de Tocqueville, of course, the 19th century French aristocrat and scholar. And the other is Martin Luther King, right? Roughly 25 years before the American Civil War, the Frenchman made a number of critical observations about the United States, right? And much has been made of Tocqueville's remarks in Democracy in America. Yet for all of its splendid commentary and its glaring limitations, Tocqueville's observations about race have stood the test of time. And they're particularly relevant, I think, this evening. For Tocqueville, enslaved peoples were neither in nor of civil society in the United States. They were the objects of a gross incivility. And in thinking about America's strange juxtaposition of liberty and freedom, he defined the choices available to slave owners rather simply. Tocqueville argued that the United States could free enslaved people and treat them with some degree of dignity, or they could perpetuate their serfdom for as long as possible. And the possibility of Black freedom, Tocqueville says 1835, the possibility of Black freedom intensified rather than alleviated white prejudices, right? King was more optimistic. Surprise, right? And King, paraphrasing the reform minister Theodore Parker, once stated that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think these two quotes really embody the distinctions between America's stated democratic claims and Black Americans' lived experiences, right? The difference between who we profess to be, which is King, and who we are, which is what Tocqueville, an outsider, recognized. And Carol Anderson's book, I think, demonstrates not merely how prophetic Tocqueville was, but that racial progress in the United States has been a bitterly contested affair. When we actually look at the historical record, rather than mythologize about the past, racial progress, I don't think is linear. It's more like a pendulum. And Americans often think of racial violence as acts of bigoted malice or, individual acts of bigoted malice. And this book, I think, forces us to redirect our gaze. The beauty, in fact, of this book is Anderson's contention that white rage is not just subtle, as you mentioned, right? It's been systematically institutionalized. And the idea that Black freedom intensifies rather than alleviates white prejudices is a shockingly predictable theme in American political development. And Tocqueville recognized this in 1835. Implicitly, or perhaps not, by the way, Anderson's book is asking us to change how we view violence and rage. We've been seduced in some ways by the horrifically violent manifestations of white rage. It's kind of Leon Litwack version of how we think about racial violence in the United States. And I'd be more than happy, y'all, to talk about these examples in the Q&A, but that's not entirely what this book is about. What if there's something more sinister at play? And I think that this book really undergirds that question. we hear this quite regularly, I think, when people answer the proverbial "what is racism" question, right? It often boils down to people seeing bigotry as an egregious act of visible hatred, rather. And I think this book speaks otherwise, not as a matter of opinion, but with recourse to the historical record. The notion that African American advancement, as Professor Jackson said, triggers white rage cannot be understated. We tell the story of American civil rights movement as a triumph narrative. And, we'd all be foolish to say that we hadn't made tremendous changes as a result of that movement. Yet the story of the American civil rights movement is beginning to be written like the story of American life after Reconstruction. And Reconstruction and the civil rights movement, right, which we refer to as the Second Reconstruction, met a similar fate. And I think African American citizenship after 1865 and the reclamation of that citizenship in 1965 gave rise to a kind of Machiavellian frenzy of rage. And American often sways back in America and Americans. I think if there's any continuity here, it's the idea that we sway back and forth between periods of greater access and periods characterized by more restrictions. And one almost always follows the other. And that's not specific to race, by the way. I think old habits, but if there's anything in this book that I think really pops out, it's the idea that old habits die hard. Right? The ideas that propped up the slave system survived the slave system. And the ideas that made Jim Crow segregation possible outlived the segregated system itself. And the Voting Rights Act, for instance, may have revolutionized representative democracy in America, but it also heightened opposition to the possibility of minority governance, right? As early as 1973, the United States Commission on Civil Rights recognized the forces of restriction had compromised the gains of the civil rights. It was 1973, right? It's not too many years after the crowning achievement of the civil rights movement was the Voting Rights Act is ratified. They argued in a manner that sounds eerily reminiscent to the situation nearly a century earlier, quote, "Finally, we have found a lack of government-wide coordination of civil rights efforts. This deplorable situation did not develop accidentally, nor were the commission's findings a surprise to those knowledgeable about civil rights and the role of the federal government. The enforcement failure was the result, to a large extent, of placing responsibility for ensuring racial and ethnic justice upon a massive federal bureaucracy, which for years has been an integral part of the discriminatory system. For every step forward, however, numerous cases of inaction can be cited," end quote. And I think the push and pull between racial equality and white supremacy is a uniquely American story, right? I mean, 2 steps forward and like 1 step backward. What if, I think this book forces us to at least grapple with this question. Like, what if freedom and bondage aren't incompatible? Take the matter of voting rights. As you mentioned, Bob, people tend to think of American democracy like it's instant coffee, right? You add water and there it is. But it's been hard fought, and not just for African Americans, right? Black people in the South. I mean, you've got universal manhood suffrage in the 1830s for unpropertied white men. You've got recently emancipated African American men. You've got all of these iterations of people trying to be part of this process. And one of the things I think that we forget is that Black people in the South have only been citizens for 56 years. And in terms of democracy, this country is developmentally adolescent. And despite all of this, I think Black Americans began to vote in record numbers after the Voting Rights Act. The history shows this. The realization, though, of Black voting proved to be one of the freedom struggle's most enduring legacies. We know that. The untold story, the story that comes out in the tail end of this book, is that their counterparts almost immediately maneuvered to undo the gains of the movement. The modern conservative party, was forged in the crucible of anti-civil rights backlash. Richard Nixon, Barry Goldwater, Ronald Reagan, Kevin Phillips. They built the modern Republican Party on antipathy to civil rights reforms. And it started almost immediately after 1965. And I think one of the things that we should remind ourselves of time and again is that African Americans were not asking for anything during the civil rights movement that their white counterparts didn't get during the New Deal, right? And we pathologized what African Americans were asking for as if they wanted more than everyone else. And as African Americans transitioned into politics, their counterparts tried to close the golden doors. That's what this book is really saying. And they diluted the power of these votes once they've been cast, or argued very publicly that Black people lack the intellectual capacity for politics. And these forces of political restriction, I think, spent the better portion of the late 20th century systematically dismantling the Voting Rights Act. And of course, this activity culminated in Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, which veritably gutted the Voting Rights Act. And I can explain this more technically in Q&A if anybody's interested. But what I think this book is getting at, and what the history shows, is that the forces of disenfranchisement may have found a new home in the politics of the 21st century, but the foundation of that home rests quite comfortably on the political machinations of the late 20th century. Resistance to voting rights is an absolute repudiation of Black civil rights. And, one last thing, I think, before, we open this up for Q&A, the story of African Americans after the Civil War really is an immigrant story. And I think African Americans not only occupied what was literally a foreign country during the Civil War, they left the area in record numbers in the early 20th century. Yet, unlike their counterparts, they found little reprieve in the West and the North. In fact, this story of Black migrants belies the politics of progress that King thought bent the universe in the right direction. And at nearly every point, any number of public policies made it difficult for Black Americans to be fully actualized citizens. And Black Americans aren't the only people, we know this, to suffer from bigotry. But I think this book demonstrates quite effectively that, and the historical record shows that they've shouldered a disproportionate amount of that bigotry. From redlining to restrictive covenants to educational segregation, access has always followed by restriction. And anyone that understands this pendulum, by the way, this pendulum that scholars have been talking about for quite some time, including Anderson, recognizes shouldn't have been the shockingly predictable of Donald Trump's presidency that followed the Obama years, right? And I think ultimately the story of King's moral universe is still being written. But given where we're at now, I think Tocqueville set the tone, and Anderson has captured that tone wonderfully in this book in a way that forces us to reimagine how we fixate our gaze on white rage and these kind of subtle iterations that have defined the continuity of this problem in American society. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. So the way that we imagine this working is I'm going to ask Bob and Julian to have just a kind of brief colloquy with one another. They've each posed some provocative questions, I think offered some comments that intersect with one another in some interesting ways. And so I'm going to ask them to just have a brief conversation among themselves, and then I'll eventually step in and begin asking some questions and feed some questions from the audience. And so as this next section of the evening unfolds, we really do urge you to pose questions and comments in the chat. And we'll be tracking those and using those for what will become a slightly more formal Q&A session toward the end here. But at the beginning, I would just urge Julian, you and Bob to go ahead and I'm curious to see how you each responded to one another's comments. I happened to just be reading de Tocqueville earlier today for a Bob Dylan related project of all things, and was struck by some of the things that you were saying. So I find him an interesting touchstone for this, because that book sort of begins by him being slightly amazed that people in power gave up power.
Right.
And it's interesting for me anyway to think about Anderson's thesis in the context, as you suggested, of de Tocqueville and his sort of still question of what did it mean that people were willing to give up power to a democratic process, and where is that going to stop? I mean, he just couldn't believe that this happened. So I'm curious about how you understand this as a kind of game of power as well, and not, I mean, it's easy to frame this in terms of civil rights, but I think both things like the 1619 Project and White Rage remind us that some of this is about the exercise of power, and especially of white power, and that one way to understand white rage is as the rage of either losing power or perceiving some loss of power. So I'd love for that maybe as a way to start this conversation.
Bob?
Well, he's mentioning Tocqueville, so why don't you take that one on, and then I'll ask you a question after that.
Sure. I think, one of the things, the continuity of the problems that carried over from the slave system into the Jim Crow era, and then from the Jim Crow era into the present, are a referendum on that very problem. What I find interesting, however, is the extent to which people who don't have a vested interest in that power have towed the party line, right? I mean, how does that account for the generations of poor white Southerners who had no stated claim in the slave system, right? I mean, and I think one of the things that we have to think about very intently is that race then becomes this kind of bonding mechanism, if you will, to hold these folks together. So I don't even, so it is about power, but there's something else in the United States that I think, Tocqueville recognized, but he couldn't quite put his finger on. It's race has been a defining characteristic of American identity since there was, from the time of colonial America. And I think he said it's interesting, for instance, that he associates what might happen to slaves with serfdom. And I think that's pretty telling in large part because he sees what's happening to African Americans through the lens of a European and through the lens of like the European system. And ultimately, he was right that people were reluctant to give up the types of power that the slave system engendered. And it's not a footnote to American history. Take Virginia, where I'm at, for instance. In the mid 18th century, 40% of the Commonwealth's population were African Americans. How is that a footnote? This is an integral part of this country, the fabric of this country's identity. And unfortunately, power meant back then, you needed 20 pounds of tobacco to vote in colonial Virginia. Well, who would have 20 pounds of tobacco but a slave owner? And these people established laws for themselves, by themselves, and they essentially steal democracy after the Civil War to do the same thing. So the continuity of what you're talking about is, I think the historical record shows is right on. And in that way, it's just as much about race as power, because I think the two are inextricably linked. Right?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, we could end up spending a lot more time talking about colonial America and the Revolutionary era, which is really when the big debates about voting and who gets to vote were playing out.
Right.
I mean, there's a very significant strain in American historiography with Gordon Wood as kind of the leader of this school that argues that democracy was really an afterthought.
Right.
And voting was not something that many of the founders took seriously as a thing.
Yep.
And broad voting, even propertied white men, is already a category that's getting frighteningly large for
Right.
people to be making decisions about state power.
Right.
And those concerns, right, the fear of what the revolution actually is creating, continue to reverberate at every moment of national transformation, right? And, I think since the revolution, it's definitely going to be the Reconstruction period when they have the most volcanic impact on
Sure.
American politics.
Mhm.
Because overnight, right, there is a new category of voters that did not exist, right, even as citizens the day
Right.
before. And, to understand that as really the process by which voting and voting rights in this country were created, right, as a very ambivalent thing, this very great skepticism that ran through so much of the thinking about voting in those early days.
Right.
We shouldn't be surprised that these kinds of things are continuing, and that, I mentioned 106 bills across state legislatures in this country. That's really just kind of par for the course. What's different
Southerners
right
were
now is that people are, I think, probably more than at any other time in my lifetime, aware of the stakes, and like Anderson, sort of seeing policy as a kind of sexy thing. Like, we need to be interested in state legislatures' arguments about voting rights, right?
Right.
That this is really where the action is. And it's as much what happens right there as, any kind of street level protesting or public,
this book could
movement or anything like that.
This book could have just been easily named, white status anxiety, right?
Sure.
Because ultimately that's what it is, right? It's this continual fear that if you go back and you look at the constitutions that replaced the Reconstruction concept, white Southerners were pretty explicit about what they were trying to do, right? Even in Virginia, they had this idea of civic virtue and this idea that there are only certain people who could participate effectively in government. I mean, they believe this stuff too. I mean, hook, line, and sinker. And I think it's shaded the ways that the whole Southern system evolved. And I think we don't recognize the kind of residuals from that if these oligarchies a handful of individuals made rules. Virginia passes a constitution in 1901 and 1902 that effectively removes 80% of African Americans from the voting ranks. The dirty little secret is it also removed 50% of whites. Virginia had one of the lowest voter turnout rates of any free democracy in the world for most of the early 20th century. Well, how does that then shade the rest of the 20th century? And what does that tell us about how these old institutions continue to act upon the manner in which we meet contemporary challenges? These are the people that essentially established the public school system. These are the people who set residential patterns that still continue to define the way that Southern cities and cities throughout the United States shook out in the 20th century. I just think the continuity of this story is a lot more present than people give it credit for.
Yeah, I would agree. It's certainly, one of the things that we argue about in graduate school when we get into our topics as historians is this basic question as to whether or not the historical periods that we're studying represent a kind of continuity, or if there is really something fundamentally different over time.
Right.
And Anderson is clearly coming out on the side of continuity here.
Yep.
But the surprise in this book is that it is a basic argument in favor. I mean, she's not arguing for white supremacy, but she is arguing for the existence and the continuity of this kind of thinking, and especially of this kind of practice of politics and policy over a very long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly since the Reconstruction period, it's not difficult to connect the dots if that's what one wants to do.
There definitely is change, by the way. There definitely is change, but it's informed by something continuous, right?
Sure. Well, let me ask you this. If you had to make a case for the civil rights movement, for example, as something that is pushing against Anderson's argument, right? How would you go about doing that? What would you actually say to argue for change in U.S. history during that period? Just take the 60s.
I'd make this. You can make similar arguments for what happened during Reconstruction and then what happened during the Civil Rights Movement. I think if it'd be interesting if you could ask the historical actors who actually watched the shift from slavery to Jim Crow, and then you ask the people who were alive during Jim Crow what life looked like after the Civil Rights Movement. And I think that they would tell you that there were monumental changes. This room is an example of some of the monumental changes, right? The fact that you and I are having this discussion, by the way, which shouldn't, in some ways, it doesn't in some way overshadow the problems that still exist. But I think there are any number of, it's the same. Look at voting rights, for instance. African Americans, essentially, there's a complexion revolution that happens in American politics after 1965. It's undeniable. In fact, it's the complexion revolution after 1965 in American voting rights and Black governance that leads to this Machiavellian frenzy, as I said, of white resistance. So on the one hand, what we have is this kind of continuous thread of white status anxiety manifest as rage. But what's changed is the fact that they're actually resisting something that's entirely new. That African Americans are bringing their biases to bear, finally, on how to shape Southern life. That's a monumental shift in American political development. And that's just one example, by the way, I think. Sure. So if there's continuity, it's in the rage. but the change is the status of African Americans changes over the course of the 20th century to give rise to different waves of rage.
Yeah, so it sounds a little bit like what is necessary for us to do then is to look into these different periods, and we can use the present moment as an example, and try to identify areas of opportunity, which might be
Right.
completely different right now than they were 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 60 years ago or whatever, right? That there may be new fronts opening up, possibilities for progress in areas that couldn't have been predicted even just a year ago, or let alone half a century ago. But
Right.
those require a level of policy knowledge, a knowledge of institutions, and also historical awareness, simply to be able to recognize them as places where change can take place, right? That turn to someone like Anderson for this long history, and the payoff, surprisingly perhaps, is that voting rights becomes the real front of the battle today, right?
So I have a question for you then. Isn't the real problem that white rage can still set the tone despite all these monumental changes in the fabric of American life, right? That white rage can eclipse all those things. That it can beat back all of these, the forces of progress. I think isn't that what this book is kind of about? That despite all of these changes, this still seems to trump, some of the better things that have happened throughout American history to move us toward this moral arc that King referred to.
Sure. Yeah, I think that would be a fair statement. And that's when you get me thinking about culture and some of the people who have used their lives to try to imagine alternative systems, alternative ways of existing, and new forms of relationships that are not as kind of structurally dependent on the status quo. And this is when people like James Baldwin become important to me, and
Right.
Toni Morrison, really interesting thinkers who set about imagining what life might look like without white supremacy shaping all of the, it's sort of like a gravitational field, and everything is thrown into relation to everything else based on that sort of field of gravity. What does it look like when we get past that, or when we can define a sort of a new set of relationships?
Or have we crossed the event horizon, Bob? Right.
Sure.
Right. Are we just sucked into this now that is this just etched into the fabric of who we are so deeply that we can't, if you look at, if you buy into the continuity thesis, I think Harold Anderson would make a case that we have crossed the proverbial Rubicon on this.
Yeah, I don't know what she'd say today. I'm reading this book. It's 4 or 5 years old, but it already feels like it's coming out of a different period of history to me, because so much has happened. Just in 2020, this sort of lash and backlash of racial politics that we've just sort of followed over the last year while we've been sequestered because of the pandemic. It's just such a remarkable setting that we find ourselves in now. I'm not sure.
It makes you wonder, and I suppose we should open it up to some questions, though. It's like, why white rage gets a pass and other types of rage do not, right? There's almost something righteous about it, or at least the way it manifests is that this is a legitimate form of anger in the United States, or more legitimate than other forms of anger. This is, you see this in the American paradox, and this kind of longstanding fear of centralized power, and you saw this the other day in Washington, and I just wonder the extent to which this is given a free pass, for reasons I think that are glaringly apparent, of course. Right.
Why don't we open it up while you ask that leading question? See what everybody else has to say.
So yeah, we have lots of questions that are taking shape here in the chat, and I'll get to those in a moment as they continue to collect. I have a couple that I think I would like to pose to the two of you. One is, and maybe this is a hazard of having two Southern historians on, is that and I, one of the things that struck me about Anderson's book, and we had Richard Rothstein here not too long ago to talk about The Color of Law, his book about the ways in which redlining sort of fundamentally reshaped northern cities. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the phenomenon of white rage and the sort of arc and the civil rights movement that you're talking about, Julian, in the context of the larger sort of context of America. That is, I think one of Anderson's critiques, of course, is that we try to pretend that it was all the South and we had the civil rights movement and we fixed the South.
Right.
There's never really a problem in Vermont or we don't talk about the Boston school busing issues, right? We don't talk about the segregation of a city like Tulsa or, essentially the sort of all white states that were formed in the West. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what it means to think about race and white rage, not simply as a Southern phenomenon, but as an American phenomenon, and the ways in which it seems to maybe work differently, as Anderson suggests, in places where that power is exercised in the more subtle kinds of ways, not Jim Crow, but in a homeowners covenant in Levittown, Pennsylvania, for example.
I think there's a section in Anderson's book where George Wallace has this epiphany when he gets these letters from Northerners about sympathizing with his ideas about segregation, and he recognizes that they hate Black people too. There's nothing exclusive about. I mean, the South wasn't leading the charge on American bigotry by any stretch of the imagination. I do think, however, I'm not even sure that it was subtle in the North. By the way. I don't think there's anything Southern, Southern or subtle about redlining or about restrictive covenants and many of the things that you just spoke about. And in some ways, what we begin to see is while Southerners might have led the way on this during slavery, and Jim Crow is probably the most glaring example of egregious visible racism, we begin to see things in the North that in some ways shake out terribly for people who are migrating out of the South into northern cities. They didn't find any, they found little, like I said, they found little reprieve up there. And so ultimately what we find is the South does not have a monopoly on American bigotry by any stretch of the imagination. And, New York City, I think to this day has the most segregated school system by class and race, if I'm not mistaken. So they're neck and neck in that regard.
Yeah, you reminded me of a few years ago. This was at Virginia. There was a visiting scholar down there who came to the Miller Center from Boston College. And he was a white man. He was a historian of foreign policy, and he gave a talk. And I was talking to him afterwards, and he came up to me and said, we're talking about race. And he was like, I can't believe how integrated all of the construction crews in Virginia are. This would never happen up in Boston.
Right.
Unions. It's so striking to see the degree of racial desegregation that's taken root in this fertile soil. And I think he was right to a great degree. The Malcolm X line about the American South begins at the Canadian border. I'm butchering the line there, but that's basically the argument. If you're south of the Canadian border, you're in the South.
Right.
That's kind of the line there.
I heard an old saying, to your point, is that nowhere in America are white people closer together yet further apart than the South, right? They know one another, that's for sure. And I think in some ways that familiarity has led to a unique type of disdain. Whereas there are people who grew up in the West and in the North that have no interaction with African Americans. So I think there's a deep difference in that regard.
Yeah.
And I'm surprised actually that we've come this far in the talk this evening without talking about the events of January 6th. So before I turn it over to the general Q&A, I know you may be historians, but and that's always reticent to focus too much on the rhyme of the past and the present. I'm very curious to hear how you think moments like this. I mean, Bob said you already feel like Carol Anderson's book was written in a different period, right? It's only 2 years old, but it feels like it could be 15 years old. So I'd be curious to hear, I mean, especially since so much, I mean, I think both of you made this point at the beginning of your talk, so much of Anderson's thesis is that racism sort of goes underground in the immediate wake of the civil rights movement. It begins to worry about things like not just the federal bureaucracy, where you can have sort of various kinds of racist practices embedded in all kinds of government programs, but as I said, homeowners covenants, it happens on every level of the sort of United States bureaucracy. And that this is where the current of racism begins to flow, is in these micro channels of power. And it seems invisible and it's hard to spot. And that's one of the reasons it becomes so powerful as a force of reaction. So how do we read an event like January 6th, which seems to be the opposite of a sort of subtle operation of power? It's a very unsubtle attempt to exercise power, and clearly has race as one of its driving, not its only factor, but clearly a driving factor. So I'm curious, is this a sense that that sort of ability to operate silently is no longer functioning, and thus we get an event like January 6th? Or is January 6th something we should have seen coming for decades?
Bob, do you want, I mean, I think
Question.
there's some different stuff going on. There are a generation of boomers who were raised to believe that upward mobility was a birthright, that simply being born in the United States meant that you would be better off than your parents. And this country's trending majority minority, right? And I meant what I said when I was talking about status anxiety. I think one of the reasons that racism is no longer underground, in large part because all those subterranean strategies that you just delineated allowed them to rework the courts and state legislatures, right? And gerrymander generations of politicians into power where you don't need to be subtle about racism anymore. Believe it or not, I mean, think about that for a second, that, the kind of racial progressivism that characterized the late 20th century. I asked my mother this question the other day. I mean, would you have possibly imagined that we would be here, in 1965 if I would have told you that? She said, absolutely not. And I think what we're dealing with is there are all of these global and national economic forces. And I think people feel more vulnerable now than they have in recent years. And in America, you know how that's going to shake out. It's going to shake out in terms of blaming others for problems that white folks feel are out of their control. And I think what happened the other day is a manifestation. I think Trump was a mascot for that. By that, right? That status anxiety that I keep bringing up. So I'm not surprised that it's out in the open now. I'm surprised it hadn't happened sooner, is what I'm surprised by.
Yeah, I would agree.
Right.
I spent that day, January 6th, it was shocking imagery, traumatic, really. And I've done research at the Library of Congress and walked around that neighborhood and, been to DC a million times, looking around. We lived in Virginia, so it wasn't far away. When you know that scene and then you see that kind of event taking place, it really, and it's a personal thing. I think a lot of people should take it personally, right? If they care about democracy. But at the same time, historically, it's not a particularly surprising event to me. And that's a depressing thing to have to say, but let's just keep it real, right? I study, among many other things, the history of racial violence in this country. What does a lynch mob look like to you, right? What does a lynch mob, how does it behave? Where does it come from? Where does it get its energy? And how does it expend its energy? So if I suggested to you that that group of people was in fact nothing more than an old-timey Jim Crow era lynch mob, it might sound like a very provocative statement, but it would not have surprised me at all to see people end up being lynched by that group of people.
That's right.
A few very slightly different things taking place inside that building. And we'd probably be having a very different conversation about it. As it is, people were actually killed there. But in reading some of the comments from the people who were breaking into the building and talking about what they thought they were doing there and what they believed, just sort of the basic assumptions that they had about where they were coming from and what they were trying to achieve. In many ways, that really maps on, almost seamlessly to a lot of the history of lynching in the United States.
Right.
And I don't want to dismiss that history because it's horrifying, but many of the people, and we're talking about thousands upon thousands of Americans who participated in extra legal violence that killed other Americans, did so with the same set of ideals about their Americanness, their understanding of their own ownership of state power, and especially about the, I don't think this is so much of a conscious thing, but I think systemically it works the same way, that there is a sort of partnership, this understanding of legal force and extra legal force that function together, right? And that's really the big picture of January 6th, that there's a combination of official sanction, right? Whether it's the president of the United States, other people who are helping to organize it, the kinds of public statements that were being made, not just that day or that week, but for months and probably years before that, right? That led up to that event. So on the one hand, it is a kind of government-sponsored event. And at the same time, there has always been a certain segment of the population that's been ready to take matters into its own hands. And that's exactly what happened right there, right? And parsing how that system actually works and where it links up is a challenging thing to do, right? And we've seen a lot of analysis of this just in the month since then. But you know, in its broad contours, it's not a surprising event. It's really not.
Let me follow this up with some terrific questions that have emerged in the chat. And there's a particular cluster of questions that I'd like to ask you that I think connect in part with what Julian was saying about status anxiety. So the first of these comes from Justin Joyce. I'm going to kind of try to combine a couple of these anyway. And he asks about the importance of capitalism to these dynamics and the ways in which race and capital intersect in particular. And another question asked about Isabel Wilkerson's recent book on caste in America as well. So I wonder if you could say something more, and then I want to ask a question about reparations as a way of following that up. But I wonder if we could start by just talking a little bit about what it means to add or think a little harder in a deeper way about what Julian was talking about in terms of status anxiety and to what degree America's inability to talk about class, for example, leads to a sort of focus that we've had throughout the night on something like white rage. And Julian, your sort of disbelief that we you know, that all these white Southerners can be disenfranchised in just the same ways, or you know, we can see all kinds of similar sort of abuses heaped on poor whites, but even they will end up on the side of this kind of, and often at the forefront of these sort of events driven by white rage. So to what degree does capitalism or thinking about capitalism help us shape this analysis, or Isabel Wilkerson's conception of caste?
Dr. Jackson?
Well, I've always been struck by, you know, in the American system with free market capitalism, the precarity of American workers. This last year, we've seen a real exposure of just how vulnerable people are financially because of the pandemic. But that is really a matter of degree, right? The normal state of affairs is one in which people who have fought tooth and nail to get a little, space in the middle class, whatever that might be, right? Middle class people are always in danger of falling out, right? And if your family got in there one generation ago or two or three, that's great, but it's no guarantee, unless you are super rich, that you're going to stay there. And this is a fact of life in the United States, and it has been for a long time. And I think that Generation X that the three of us belong to is really the kind of the group of people who have been dealing with this in the most direct way, because inheriting a set of assumptions from baby boomers who could still rely or believe in class mobility in an upward trajectory. That's no longer the case, right, for people our age and younger.
Yep.
And so this kind of anxiety that comes with the class system in the United States is just sort of a part of our psychology. There's always that sort of fear in the back of our minds that one illness one job loss, one accident, whatever it might be, might cost us everything and reduce us. And middle class status is not just about wealth. It's about dignity. It's about identity. It's really a kind of foundational aspect of who we imagine ourselves to be. So when it is suggested to people that some other group is coming along to threaten your very precarious place in this model, it's really easy to activate the kind of anxiety, right, and to manipulate huge groups of people, not just poor people, middle class people, nouveau riche, however you want to put it. And as it turns out, there are a lot of very wealthy people in this country who have class anxiety and don't believe they're wealthy.
Right.
So this is all part of a program in which class and race are used as parts of the same process. They're really inseparable from one another, in my view.
I
It's
agree.
a tough situation because race is, racism, as William Faulkner put it many years ago, is profitable. And until it ceases to be profitable, it will probably continue to have this prominent position in our life.
I think, a lot of times when we, back to lynching, a lot of times when we think about lynching in the United States, we see it as an act of something that is a result of, kind of sexual violence or the threat thereof. But economic jealousy, right, led to a lot of lynchings, including in Tulsa, by the way. I think, since emancipation, the idea of African-American upward mobility always led whites to think of this as a zero-sum game. And that meant that anything that African-Americans gained was taking something away. But it's also psychological. Imagine being raised in a culture where people from birth are telling you that African-Americans represent a missing link in the evolutionary chain. They're less human. They're not nearly as intelligent. They lack the basic, fundamental components of being a fully actualized human. And then you turn around after emancipation, and these people are actually living better lives than you, right? Imagine how that's settled with, there's this scene, this might seem off topic, but it's not. There's this scene in Harriet Jacobs' book when she's recounting whites coming into slave communities after the Nat Turner Rebellion, and they're finding books in slave quarters that they can't believe, right? Of course, these middling whites that go to these slave quarters, they can't believe that some of these slaves can read because they couldn't read. And I think you see the similar pattern here that there's this kind of implicit belief, stated or not, that there's no possible way that African Americans could be doing economically better than certain people. And I think that leads to a kind of resentment about economic upward mobility in Black communities that manifests in white rage, especially from middling whites. Obviously, upper class whites are going to be threatened by that in the same way. And I think we see that repeatedly over the course of the 20th century.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's as present now, I think, as it's ever been.
Right.
If you look at imagine the sort of coalition of racial reactionaries that functions in this society, it's not really coming necessarily from one demographic in terms of class. It really reaches across, right? It's suburban, it's rural, it can be urban, it's trans-regional, and there are many different factors that play into this sort of identification.
Right.
And I think that speaks to the effectiveness. I don't want to say the universality because I hope it's not universal, but the ease with which this kind of racial grievance politics can be practiced effectively.
Right.
It is. It's easy to pick people off because of the very real economic constraints that we all live under. Until, like, you hit the nail on the head when you called it a zero-sum game.
Right.
When it's perceived to be a case, right, that one person's vote actually prevents another person from voting, right? When it's perceived to be the case that one person's job is going to mean someone else
Unemployment,
is
right?
unemployed.
Yeah,
That is just a recipe for disaster.
that's right.
So, unfortunately, this is really the model that is being peddled in certain circles.
But I still think deep down it rankles certain whites when African Americans achieve, right, a certain level of economic success. There's certain people
Absolutely.
that can't stomach it, and we all know how that shook out during Jim Crow, and I think that there are still shades of that in the 21st century.
Oh yeah, I would agree with that 100%.
So as you both know, this event is being sponsored in part by the Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission, and so that example of white rage, and especially of a community that can't stand Black wealth and Black success, literally invading, right, the northern part of the city and burning it to the ground, and then declaring it a riot and essentially preventing it from rebuilding, and then eventually building a highway through that community. In terms of this question of capitalism in particular, this is a question from Marlon Lavenhar here in the chat. He asks about reparations, which is a serious topic as we approach the centenary here in Tulsa. And the response of many white people is quite negative in the city, as you can imagine. Now, curiously, if you saw the Watchmen HBO series, its alternative history of Tulsa is built around the idea of reparations for the massacre, which actually lead to this prosperous, sort of diverse, thriving, science fictional Tulsa in the future. So the question here really is is to both of you, just what role should reparations play? It's not something that, for example, Anderson talks very much about in her book, but I'm curious to hear both of your thoughts about reparations in response to this intersection of status and class and race that seems to be at the nexus of a lot of the conversation this evening.
Can I turn that question on its head, right? Sure. Within the context of this book, right? This book is arguing that African American advancement, right, is often followed by these instances of white rage. What do you think would happen, right? If that was achieved, I can imagine an eruption of nuclear proportions. By the way, and I'm not saying that it shouldn't happen. I'm just saying we're going to see a shockingly predictable response. Right. I mean, if the past is prologue, if what Carol Anderson is saying is true, if what historians have been saying is true, if what Bob and I write about is true, I think we know what's coming down the line. Should that take place? And I think that's, but I think there's to the question, there's a very narrow understanding of what reparations might look like. People talk about it in terms of financial, compensation. I think what we recognize is some of the darker effects of American racism have been institutional. And I think that things done on purpose can only be undone purposely, right? And if there's going to be reparations, it needs to be institutional, it needs to be effective, it needs to be thorough, and it needs to be supervised. It needs to do all the things that they didn't do during Reconstruction and they didn't do after the Civil Rights Movement to preserve the gains that people made at those specific moments in history. We need to look back on history and say, how did we get it wrong then? And not doing right by these folks, and how can we do this differently in the future? And I think if there's a theme here, is that if it's not looked after and cultivated and maintained, then it's political window dressing at best, and it might have the unintended but shockingly predictable consequence of igniting white rage of epic proportions. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I've struggled with this question for years. And it's even just the term reparations, it's so radioactive. What you're talking about as you've got the right idea. It's such a polarizing concept that I'm not even sure that the term itself, it's certainly not politically useful. It's just more trouble than it's worth in some ways. But the idea of generating a social order in which everyone is is simply respected and institutionally, right? That basic human rights and civil rights and citizenship rights are not something that have to be fought for tooth and nail institutionally, but are a given, right? That would require a number of things, right? What Julian's talking about as the sort of structural changes to the system, right? That require a different set of policies is one part of it. But I think that one of the things that Anderson's book is really suggesting is that a whole new set of assumptions about race and about the ways in which people imagine themselves as racial persons, right, would have to change. Probably the eradication of the idea that there are white people would be a good start. And this is one of the places that James Baldwin constantly returns, right? The imagination of white people who insist that they exist as a certain thing. And it's always defined as strictly in binary terms up against some imaginary idea of what Black people are, right? And this basic binary, that would have to change in some ways. But the broader context of reparations to me is more fruitfully and constructively imagined with I like the term investment, right? What are the areas that you have to invest in? Because everybody, business people understand this term, political groups do, right? Think about the future. What are the areas that over the long term you truly have to invest in order to strengthen entire groups of people so that they can make contributions to the civil order as a whole? And to me, that's where the conversation about reparations begin. And it can certainly have all of the historical awareness that we have about the failed promise of emancipation and Reconstruction and the benign neglect or worse that took place after civil rights. That's all part of the story. But we have a very different set of circumstances right now. We have to deal with things like climate. We have to deal with things like prisons and, there are all kinds of contemporary issues, food, housing in really basic ways that are different now than they've been ever before, right? So thinking about the contemporary set of situations that we have and deciding where to invest that would be kind of the way that I would try to frame the conversation.
Right.
I wonder if you could say more about that historical context that you're describing there, Bob, because it does, I think in both your comments, I understand entirely what you're saying. I will say that when we had, as I said, we had Richard Rothstein here not too long ago, he made quite an ardent argument in favor of the need for reparations, building in part on things like the fact that property was expropriated from Blacks here in Tulsa, right? They burned it down, transferred some of it to white control, right? That generations of sort of white wealth here in Tulsa are built on essentially theft from Black and Native American peoples. And so sort of starting now, how do we invest into the future feels a little like, let's pretend we don't have history. And that when we hear this a great deal, I think in the conversations around January 6th, right? No, we have to have a reckoning with justice before we can start talking about unity in political policy. I mean, we need to have some accounting of the justice for the past. So I'm curious how you would respond to that kind of pushback against an argument like this that says, well, what about the immediate wound that's still visible in the sort of burned out, their North Tulsa is studded with concrete steps to burn down houses that go nowhere, that to land that's owned by families that still live here, and say that was taken from me. You can't expect me to say, great, I hope you put a little bit more money into the schools here.
But you can't
feel like that's going to be an easy.
You can't have reconciliation without recognition, man. I think, and I totally agree with you, right? But we know what's going to happen. I think the bigger problem is that we don't recognize how much of a high stakes game, historical awareness is. There are just a lot of people that are completely unfamiliar with what you just articulated. There needs to be a broad-based campaign to articulate just that in a manner that I think starts to bend people toward understanding just what was taken. And then I think when you get to that point, when you raise like when you raise awareness, I know this sounds like hopelessly optimistic, right? But when, because I'm a historian and it's, you know, hammer nail, I look for historical solutions to historical problems. And I think that awareness sometimes matters. And I think the problem is, you know, we know the kind of the ways that people are going to respond, especially when we're talking about African Americans, the financial recompense. But I think if you do something like that, and you raise awareness to actually to precisely what was taken from folks, you might be able to stave off some of the backlash. I don't disagree, by the way, that when you could, you know, Ta-Nehisi Coates, I love it, but historians have been talking about drawing a direct line between Jim Crow segregation and reparations and not slavery for quite some time, right? We know how much African Americans were paying in taxes and saw nothing in return in public service deliverables. You know, one of the you know 20th century historians wish archives would burn up, truth be told, because it's too much to read, right? There's plenty of documentation of what happened to African Americans. It's right there in black and white in meticulous city records and in things like you just articulated. I think a good case could be made to do precisely what Richard Rothstein is saying, but it can't be done in a bubble, and it has to be done by what I would call broad-based effort to raise consciousness and awareness about precisely what took place, and you just got to bombard people with the data, right?
That's good. That's good. I certainly, Sean, wasn't suggesting that there should be anything ahistorical or advocating letting bygones be bygones or willful forgetting of the past. I mean, that would be absurd for somebody like me to even contemplate that idea. The real question in this conundrum is whether or not we envision reparations as a political problem, an economic problem, or a philosophical problem. Right, because there are different registers, and this is one of the reasons it's such a difficult question, on which the problem moves. You know, people who can trace their ancestry to slavery, for example, right? It's 56 years since emancipation. And it's not as if that group of people simply stopped existing in 1865 and you can reconstitute them today. All of the history and all of the ongoing extremely complex things that have happened, all right, across this period of time have shaped, you know, everybody's lives for generations. Right. And that's not to dismiss the specifics of reparations or to shift the conversation away from it. I'm just trying to draw attention to the sheer difficulty of imagining it in policy terms in ways that would actually work politically. I don't even know. I'm kind of pessimistic that it's possible for the same reasons that Julian is. And you know, we're operating in a world in which education levels and right knowledge of empirical reality. I don't want to get too presentist with some of my language here, but facts are not really the most common things that people have been using lately, right? And this is a you know, would necessarily be a central aspect of the conversation if it were undertaken, right? So when I say I kind of prefer thinking about investment, that to me represents a kind of a more hopeful version of a similar conversation in which thinking about the roles of institutions, whether it's education or healthcare or whatever, land ownership, any of these things would be able to be envisioned in more practical terms. So, but of course, I mean, all of the historical things that you guys are talking about would immediately become important aspects of that conversation.
And let me follow that up by asking a question to kind of concatenate several questions here. Many of the people here tonight are educators. And Julian, I think you were sort of saying flood them with the data, but I would love to hear from both of you a little bit about the role of education when we think about things like the 1619 Project, which is a phenomenal thing unto itself, despite all of the debate that it has engendered, but also significant movements, including in places like Texas, to strike it entirely and ban its teaching from the curriculum. What kinds of interventions do you think educators in particular can make to sort of uncover both this history of white rage and to maybe set the stage for the kinds of conversations around reparations or investment that the two of you are describing?
Are we talking about K through 12 or higher education, by the way? That's right.
I don't have a specific answer to that question. I will say that this connects to another question that's here in the chat about the fact that they're building a kind of historical center, research center, museum around the race massacre here called Greenwood Rising. So I would say it's both K through 12, higher education, and the kind of public history that you do, Julian. That is, where can we put these kinds of educational moments, and how can they be positioned most effectively throughout the sort of education systems that we have? It's a broad question, I understand, but I'm curious what specific interventions you can imagine being made, even for those of us who are teaching college or high school or imagining what this thing ought to look like in Tulsa.
Yeah. Well, just start with something that's one of the most glaring facts of the education system that exists in this country right now. And that has to do with how school districts are funded. They're funded from local tax bases, right? What would it look like if all of that was done away with and everybody in the entire state of Oklahoma or Virginia received exactly the same amount of education funding as everyone else? That the school system for K through 12 or Head Start through 12 or K through 16 mandated an equitable distribution of resources, so that there was one school system that operated at the state level. European countries that are a lot smaller, France and England and Germany and places like that, they do it for the entire nation, so that wherever you are, your education is inseparable from everyone else's, right? But in the United States, there is a wild disparity. And I'm just talking about public education right here, in the quality of educational outcomes that we see. So there's some really basic things that could be done to change educational outcomes. And almost immediately, you're going to discover what a non-starter many of those ideas are. The idea that every child in the Tulsa metro area or in the state of Oklahoma should be funded exactly the same for K through 12 would meet incredible resistance from the usual suspects.
Of course.
But it's a really basic idea.
I think to speak about the heritage industry and the museum community, and you were talking about someone establishing a center to raise consciousness about the events that happened in Tulsa. I think one of the things we've recognized in Richmond, especially around Confederate, this kind of toxic iconography that continues to dot Southern landscapes, is the first thing is like recognizing that some people will just cannot be converted. And you read it, you recognize who the audience is and who's worth winning over and who's not. And and even more importantly, I think this is particularly what's been interesting about what's going on here, because no other state has more monuments to the Confederacy than the Commonwealth of Virginia. We recognize, like, who is our obligation to? Is it to people who are? Is it to the gone for gooders? Is it to people who are alive now, or is it to future generations of people who have not yet been born? And I think those are the types of conversations that you need to have if you want to have meaningful discussions about how to memorialize the past, the forgotten past in particular. Is number one, realize who your allies are; two, who's worth converting; and three, who your audience is. And because you can't speak to all people, I think a lot of times in many of these endeavors are meant to try to convert dyed-in-the-wool racists, right? It's like as if. And that somehow, large bodies of information are going to get them off their lethargy and change their minds. And that's just not the case. I think what we've recognized in this part of the country is that we have an obligation to recognize who our audiences are and do the best we can at bringing the historical method to bear on telling good history in a manner that can get us where we need to be so that we can, at some point, start to reconcile these deep wounds, right?
That's terrific. And as I said, it's I think a really useful comment for us to end the conversation tonight, Julian, in part because it is very much a present question here. How do you remember this past? How do we build these kinds of public access points? And it takes us back to, I think, the very first question I asked about the exercise of power versus the kind of de Tocqueville imagining this sort of unified polity, as opposed to, a democratic play of forces, where, as you said, we're not all going to agree, and there's like consensus is not the same thing as democracy.
Right.
So I find some really interesting connections that have threaded throughout this evening. Bob, Julian, I'm grateful to both of you for joining us for this hour and a half. It has been a terrific, probing conversation, as I thought it might be, and I've certainly been surprised and about a lot of what I've heard, surprised in a good way. I'm thinking, I hope those of you who've joined us here this evening are thinking hard as well. I want to thank all of you for joining us and coming out this evening. I also want to remind you that this evening's event will be paired in just about 2 months with a program called Black Rage, where we'll talk about the role that Black Rage has played throughout the civil rights movement, as well as the sort of development of various kinds of agency as well. So we'll be doing the same thing around that program. We'll be giving away books and hosting a similar kind of conversation. So Julian, Bob, I want to thank you once again. You can't hear the applause, I'm sure, from where you are, but maybe Bob can attest. I can hear it faintly ringing outside my my windows here in Tulsa. So thank you again, both of us, for joining us. And thank you to everyone. I hope you have a good evening. Take care of yourselves and take care of